The last rays of sunset filtered through the tall windows of Westlake University's music hall, painting golden streaks across the polished wood floor. Most students had left for the day, heading to dinner or evening study sessions, but the soft melody of a piano echoed through the empty corridors. Elena Dawson sat at the grand piano, her fingers dancing across the keys with practiced precision. At 22, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had grown up, never doubting her place in the world. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical bun, revealing the slight furrow of concentration between her brows. She paused, sighed, and started the passage again. The notes were technically perfect, they always were, but something was missing. Her professor had mentioned it just that afternoon. "Technically flawless, Miss Dawson," Professor Lee had said, his voice gentle but firm, "but I'm still waiting to feel something." Elena's hand stilled on the keys. She'd been hearing variations of that criticism since her first year. Technical perfection was something she could achieve through discipline and practice. But this other quality, this emotional connection, remained frustratingly elusive. A soft squeaking sound from the back of the hall caught her attention. Elena turned to see a man pushing a cleaning cart through the doorway. He was older, perhaps in his 60s, with silver hair and a slightly stooped posture that suggested years of physical work. The university janitor. She'd seen him around but had never paid much attention. The man nodded politely when he noticed her looking. "Don't mind me, miss. Just need to empty the bins. You keep playing." His voice was unexpectedly refined, with a hint of an accent Elena couldn't quite place. She nodded back and returned to the piano, trying to ignore his presence as he moved quietly around the edges of the room. After 3 more attempts at the same passage, Elena slammed her hands down on the keys in frustration. The discordant sound echoed through the hall. "Having trouble?" the janitor asked, pausing near the stage. Elena hadn't meant to draw attention to herself. Normally, she maintained perfect composure, especially around university staff, but today's criticism had cracked something in her usually polished facade. "Just a difficult passage," she said, trying to sound unbothered. The old man tilted his head, listening as she played the section again. "Sounds perfect to me," he said with a small shrug. "That's the problem," Elena muttered. "Perfect but empty." To her surprise, the janitor chuckled. "Music isn't about perfection. It's about feeling." Elena turned fully on the bench to face him, annoyed by his presumption. "Are you a music critic now?" The moment the words left her mouth, she regretted their sharpness. The man had done nothing to deserve her rudeness, but instead of looking offended, his eyes crinkled with amusement. "No, miss. Just a man who's heard a lot of music in his time." There was something in his expression, a quiet dignity that made Elena feel suddenly childish. She smoothed her skirt and turned back to the piano. "Well, unless you can show me how to play with more feeling, I'm not sure your observations are helpful." She meant it as a dismissal, but the janitor didn't move. Instead, he leaned slightly on his mop. "Sometimes," he said slowly, "you need to live a little before you can put feeling into music." Elena rolled her eyes, a bubble of laughter escaping her.
"Live a little?"
"I've been playing piano since I was 4. I've performed in 7 countries. I think I've lived plenty." The janitor smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "That's not the kind of living I mean." Something about his quiet certainty irritated her. Who was this man to give her advice about music? About living? A strange, reckless mood seized her. "Fine," she said, sliding to one side of the bench and patting the empty space. "Show me then. Play something with feeling." The janitor's eyes widened slightly and he shook his head. "Oh no, miss. That's not my place." "Afraid?" Elena teased, surprised by her own boldness. "It's easy to critique when you don't have to perform yourself." The man's weathered face remained impassive, but Elena thought she detected a flicker of something. Pride, perhaps, in his eyes. "I clean floors, miss. I don't play pianos. Not even a simple tune." She pressed, enjoying the unusual feeling of being unpredictable, even rebellious. Her parents and professors always saw her as the perfect, obedient daughter and student. It felt surprisingly good to act out of character. The janitor shook his head again and resumed his cleaning, moving toward the back of the hall. Elena felt a twinge of disappointment, though she couldn't say why. She turned back to the piano, but instead of returning to her practice piece, she began playing a playful, simple melody, the kind of tune anyone could recognize. She glanced over her shoulder to see the janitor pausing in his work, listening. A sudden wild idea struck her. "Hey," she called out, "I have a proposition for you." The man looked up, eyebrows raised in question. "If you can play something, anything that actually moves me, that makes me feel something." She paused, searching for a suitably dramatic promise. "I'll marry you." She laughed loudly at her own ridiculous suggestion, the sound bouncing off the high ceiling of the hall. The absurdity of it, the wealthy, talented music student proposing to marry the elderly janitor over a piano performance, struck her as hilariously outrageous. The janitor stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he shook his head with a small smile and continued sweeping. "You university kids and your jokes," he murmured, just loudly enough for her to hear. Elena's laughter faded, leaving her feeling slightly foolish. She hadn't meant to be cruel, just playful. There was something about the old man that intrigued her, a dignity that seemed at odds with his position. "I'm sorry," she said, suddenly serious. "That was inappropriate." The janitor waved a hand dismissively. "No harm done." Elena watched him work for a moment, noticing the careful precision in his movements. He cleaned with the same attention to detail that she brought to her music. "I'm Elena," she offered, feeling she owed him at least the courtesy of an introduction after her behavior. "Thomas," he replied without looking up. "Thomas Garvey." "How long have you worked here, Mr. Garvey?" "Going on 15 years now." He emptied a trash bin into his cart. "And it's just Garvey. No need for formalities." Elena nodded, though he wasn't looking at her. 15 years was longer than she'd been playing piano seriously. She wondered what his life had been like before Westlake. What path had led him to cleaning university halls instead of, well, whatever he might have done instead. "Do you like music, Garvey?" she asked, genuinely curious now. He paused, and for a moment she thought he might not answer. "Everyone likes music," he said finally. "It's the universal language, isn't it?" There was something in his tone, a depth of feeling that seemed to contradict his simple words. Elena found herself wondering what kind of music he enjoyed. What songs had marked important moments in his life? "What kind do you like?" she pressed. Garvey smiled faintly. "All kinds that are played with heart." Before she could ask another question, he had moved through the double doors at the back of the hall, the soft squeak of his cart fading into silence. Elena sat alone at the piano, her practice forgotten. She played a few notes absently, thinking about the strange conversation. There was something about Thomas Garvey that didn't quite fit the image of a simple janitor. His speech, his bearing, the way he had listened to her playing with what seemed like genuine understanding. She shook her head, dismissing the thoughts. She was romanticizing an ordinary interaction, turning a maintenance worker into a mysterious figure simply because she was bored with her own predictable life. Her wild proposal had been inappropriate and probably embarrassing for the poor man. Tomorrow, she decided, she would apologize properly. For now, she needed to focus on her practice. Elena turned back to her music sheets, determined to find the elusive emotional quality her professor had demanded. But as she played, her mind kept wandering back to Garvey's words. Music isn't about perfection. It's about feeling. What did he know about it? And why did she have the nagging feeling that it might be more than she'd assumed? The last notes of her practice piece hung in the air as the room grew darker with the setting sun. Elena gathered her things, her mind still on the strange encounter. Something told her that the conversation with Thomas Garvey wasn't finished, that somehow their paths would cross again in this hall where music and life sometimes blended in unexpected ways. The next afternoon, Elena arrived at the music hall earlier than usual. She told herself it was to get extra practice before her upcoming recital, but truthfully, she was hoping to catch Thomas Garvey before he began his evening rounds. She sat at the piano, half-heartedly playing scales while watching the door. After 30 minutes with no sign of the janitor, Elena sighed and focused on her actual practice. She was midway through her second piece when Professor Lee entered the hall. "Much better today, Miss Dawson," he said, approaching the piano. "There's a bit more life in your playing." Elena smiled politely, though she hadn't been aware of playing any differently. "Thank you, Professor. Have you decided what you'll perform for the spring showcase?" He leaned against the piano, his thin glasses sliding slightly down his nose. "I was thinking Chopin, perhaps, the Nocturne in E-flat major." Professor Lee nodded thoughtfully. "A beautiful piece, but perhaps too safe for you at this point." You've mastered the technical aspects. Now might be the time to challenge yourself emotionally. There it was again, that vague critique of her emotional connection to music. Elena bit back a frustrated response. I'll consider something more challenging, she said instead. After the professor left, Elena returned to her practice with renewed determination. She was so absorbed in her playing that she didn't notice Garvey until he was already halfway down the center aisle, pushing his cart. Mr. Garvey? She called out, then corrected herself. I mean Garvey. He looked up, surprise briefly crossing his weathered face. Miss Dawson, you're still here. I wanted to apologize for yesterday, she said, standing from the piano bench. My comment about marrying you was inappropriate. Garvey chuckled, the sound warm and unexpectedly youthful. No need to worry. I've heard worse from students over the years. Elena smiled, relieved. Still, it wasn't right. My mother would be horrified at my manners. Apology accepted then. He nodded and turned to continue his work. Wait, Elena found herself saying. Can I ask you something? Garvey paused, one eyebrow slightly raised. Yesterday you seemed to know something about music. The way you listened. She trailed off, suddenly feeling foolish. Everyone knows something about music, he replied with a slight shrug. Some just have fancier words for it than others. But you, Elena hesitated. Never mind. It was nice talking to you. She turned back to the piano, feeling oddly disappointed. She wasn't sure what she'd expected from the conversation. Bach. Elena turned around. What? You asked what kind of music I like. Garvey was sorting cleaning supplies on his cart, not looking at her. Bach is one answer. The complexity hidden beneath the simplicity. Like life itself. Elena stared at him. Most people she knew would say something like pop, rock, or classical if asked about music preferences. Not many would specify Bach with a philosophical explanation. Who are you, really? She asked before she could stop herself. Garvey finally looked up, his eyes crinkling slightly at the corners. Just a janitor, miss. Nothing more or less. Before she could respond, the hall doors opened and a group of first-year students entered, chattering loudly as they prepared for their evening practice session. Elena nodded a goodbye to Garvey and gathered her things. As she left, she overheard one of the students. That's her, Elena Dawson. They say she's technically perfect but plays like a robot. Heat rushed to Elena's cheeks as she hurried out, pretending not to hear. The next day, Elena was in the university library, researching for a music history paper when she overheard two graduate assistants talking in the next aisle. Did you know that janitor used to be a pianist? One whispered, which janitor? The other asked, the older one with the silver hair? Garvey, I think his name is. Professor Richardson mentioned it yesterday. Said he was admitted to Juilliard decades ago but never attended. Elena froze, her hand halfway to a book on the shelf. Really? What happened? Not sure. Richardson didn't say. But apparently he heard him playing once after hours. Said it was incredible. Elena waited until the graduate assistants moved on before pulling out her phone. She searched Thomas Garvey pianist but found nothing relevant. Next, she tried Thomas Garvey Juilliard, which also yielded no results. That evening, she returned to the music hall earlier than usual, hoping to catch Garvey alone. She was in luck. He was emptying a trash can near the entrance when she arrived. Is it true? She asked without preamble. Garvey looked up, startled by her sudden appearance. Is what true, Miss Dawson? That you were accepted to Juilliard? Something shifted in his expression. A tightening around the eyes, a slight stiffening of his shoulders. Where did you hear that? His voice was carefully neutral. Around. Is it true? Garvey returned to his work, methodically tying the trash bag. People talk a lot in universities. Not all of it means anything. That's not an answer, Elena persisted, following him as he moved to the next bin. No, he agreed. It's not. Elena felt a flash of frustration. Why won't you just tell me? Garvey straightened, looking at her directly for perhaps the first time. Why does it matter to you, Miss Dawson? The question caught her off guard. Why did it matter? She barely knew this man. I'm curious, I suppose. Curiosity about other people's lives doesn't entitle you to answers, he said. Not unkindly, but firmly. Elena took a step back, stung by the gentle rebuke. You're right. I'm sorry. She turned to leave, embarrassed by her forwardness. It was a long time ago. Garvey's voice stopped her. Another lifetime, really? Elena turned back slowly. Garvey wasn't looking at her, but out the tall windows where the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the campus. "So it is true?" she asked quietly. He sighed. "Yes, I was accepted." "Never went. Why not? Life happens. Dreams change." He gave a small shrug. "My father got sick. Family needed money more than they needed a pianist." The simplicity of his answer made Elena's chest tighten. She thought of her own life, the expensive lessons, the competitions her parents had flown her to, the unwavering support for her musical education. "I'm sorry," she said, meaning it. "Don't be. We all make choices. I made mine." Elena wanted to ask more. Whether he regretted his choice, if he still played somewhere private. What might have been. But something in his manner told her the conversation was over. The following week, Elena found herself looking for Garvey whenever she practiced. Sometimes he would nod hello. Sometimes they would exchange brief pleasantries. But he never mentioned their conversation about Juilliard again. One evening, after a particularly frustrating session with Professor Lee, Elena stayed later than usual. The criticism was always the same: technical perfection without emotional depth. She didn't know how to fix what she couldn't understand. As the hall emptied and twilight gathered outside the tall windows, Elena remained at the piano, playing the same passage over and over. She was so absorbed in her frustration that she didn't notice Garvey until he spoke. "You're overthinking it." Elena jumped slightly, her hands faltering on the keys. "Pardon?" Garvey was standing at the edge of the stage, leaning on his mop. "The music. You're thinking too much, not feeling enough." The criticism, so similar to her professor's, irritated her. "And how exactly do I fix that?" To her surprise, Garvey set his mop aside and walked toward the piano. For a moment, she thought he might actually sit down and play. Instead, he stopped a respectful distance away. "What's the piece about?" he asked. Elena frowned. "It's Beethoven's Sonata No. 8. It's about—" "Well, it's just a sonata." "No." Garvey shook his head. "What's it about to you? When you play it, what are you trying to say?" Elena opened her mouth, then closed it again. She had never thought about music that way. "I'm trying to play it correctly," she finally said. Garvey smiled, a hint of sadness in his eyes. "That's the problem, isn't it? Music isn't just notes on a page. It's a conversation, a story. If you have nothing to say, why would anyone want to listen?" The words stung, but Elena couldn't deny their truth. "What would you say?" she asked. "If you were playing this piece, what would you want people to hear?" Garvey was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. "Loss," he finally said. "The struggle to accept what cannot be changed. And then somehow finding beauty in what remains." Elena stared at him, struck by the depth of his answer. "Is that what Beethoven intended? Does it matter? Music belongs to the player as much as the composer." Garvey stepped back, returning to his mop. "At least that's what I believe." As he turned to leave, Elena called after him. "Will you ever play for me?" Garvey paused at the door.
"Why would you want to hear an old janitor play?"
"Because," Elena said, "I think you have something to say." He didn't answer, just gave a small nod before disappearing into the corridor. But as the door swung closed behind him, Elena thought she saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. A spark of what might have been pride, or perhaps just recognition. The following week brought heavy rain that drummed against the music hall windows and created a soothing backdrop to Elena's practice sessions. She found herself staying later each evening, partly to avoid the downpour but mostly hoping for another conversation with Garvey. On Thursday, after her fellow students had hurried off to dinner, Elena remained at the piano. Instead of practicing her assigned pieces, she played a simpler melody, a folk tune her grandmother had taught her when she was very young. It was the kind of music her professors would dismiss as unsophisticated. But as her fingers moved across the familiar patterns, she felt a comfort she rarely experienced with more complex compositions. She was so absorbed that she didn't hear Garvey enter until his cleaning cart squeaked near the back of the hall. Elena continued playing but watched from the corner of her eye as he paused in his work, listening. When the piece ended, she turned on the bench to face him. "My grandmother taught me that. Before I had formal lessons." Garvey nodded appreciatively. "You played it differently." "Different from what?" "Different from your usual style." He moved closer, leaning on his mop. There was memory in it, feeling. Elena felt an unexpected rush of pleasure at his observation. It reminds me of summers at my grandparents' house, before everything became about competitions and perfection. Miss Dawson, Professor Lee said, standing. Perfect timing. I'd like you to meet Mrs. Chen, our new department benefactor. Elena set down her bag and approached with a polite smile. Mrs. Chen was elegant, with silver-streaked black hair and sharp eyes that seemed to evaluate everything they saw. So this is your star pupil, Mrs. Chen said, extending a hand. Her grip was surprisingly firm. I look forward to hearing you play tomorrow. Elena's stomach tightened. You'll be at the evaluation? Mrs. Chen will be attending all the junior year evaluations, Professor Lee explained. She's considering funding a scholarship for one student to attend a summer program in Vienna. Vienna. The word hung in the air like a glittering promise. Elena had dreamed of studying there since she was 12. I'm honored, she managed to say. Don't be honored yet, Mrs. Chen said with a slight smile. Be excellent tomorrow. After they left, Elena sank onto the piano bench, her hands shaking slightly. The stakes had just risen dramatically. It wasn't just about passing her evaluation now. It was about Vienna. She began to practice, but the pressure made her revert to her old habits. Her playing was technically perfect, but mechanical. After an hour, she stopped, frustrated with herself. The hall door opened and Elena turned, expecting to see Garvey with his cart. Instead, a young man from the maintenance department entered. Oh, sorry, he said. Didn't know anyone was in here. Just checking the thermostat. Where's Mr. Garvey? Elena asked. He usually cleans this hall. Called in sick. First time in years, apparently. The maintenance worker adjusted the thermostat and left. Elena stared at the empty doorway, feeling strangely abandoned. She had been counting on Garvey's advice before tomorrow's performance. Without him, she felt adrift. She tried to practice again, but after another frustrating hour, she gathered her things and left. Outside, the sunshine had faded and dark clouds were gathering again on the horizon. On impulse, Elena stopped at the university's administration building. The elderly receptionist looked up as she approached the desk. Can I help you? I need to check on a staff member, Elena said. Mr. Thomas Garvey? He works in maintenance. I heard he was ill. The receptionist peered at her over half-moon glasses. Are you family? No, Elena hesitated. What was she? A student, a friend? Neither seemed to capture the strange relationship they had developed. I'm concerned about him. He's been mentoring me. Something in her voice must have conveyed her sincerity, because the receptionist's expression softened. Technically, I shouldn't give out personal information, she said, lowering her voice. But since you're concerned, he called in with a fever. First sick day in 12 years, poor man. Lives alone too. Do you have his address? Elena asked. The receptionist hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. She wrote something on a slip of paper and slid it across the desk. I didn't give you this, she said firmly. Elena nodded. Thank you. 30 minutes later, she was standing outside a small apartment building on the edge of town. It was modest but well-maintained, with flower boxes in some windows. She found Garvey's name on the buzzer panel and pressed it before she could lose her nerve. No answer. She tried again, holding the button longer. Finally, a crackling voice came through the speaker. Yes? Mr. Garvey? It's Elena Dawson. From the university. A long pause. Miss Dawson? What are you doing here? I heard you were sick. I was worried. Now that she was actually here, Elena felt foolish. What had she been thinking, showing up uninvited at his home? Another pause. Then the door buzzed. Third floor, apartment 3B. Elena climbed the stairs, her heart pounding with unexpected nervousness. She had never seen Garvey outside the university setting. It felt like crossing an invisible boundary. The door to 3B opened as she reached the landing. Garvey stood there in plain trousers and a faded blue sweater, so different from his work uniform that Elena almost didn't recognize him. His face was pale, with a slight sheen of sweat on his forehead. You shouldn't be here, he said, but stepped back to let her in. The apartment was small but tidy, with bookshelves lining one wall and a worn armchair angled toward a window overlooking the street. What caught Elena's attention, however, was the upright piano in the corner, old and obviously well used. You have a piano, she said, surprised. It was my mother's. Garvey moved to the kitchenette. Would you like some tea? I was just making some for my throat. Yes, thank you. Elena remained standing awkwardly in the center of the room. I'm sorry to intrude. My evaluation is tomorrow and I was hoping for some last-minute advice. Garvey filled a kettle and set it on the stove. I'm not sure what more I can tell you. You know what you need to do? That's the problem. I don't think I do. Elena wrapped her arms around herself. There's more pressure now. A benefactor will be there. She's offering a scholarship to study in Vienna. Ah. Garvey nodded, understanding. And now you're overthinking everything again. Exactly. The kettle whistled and Garvey poured water into 2 mugs. His movements were slower than usual, slightly unsteady. You should be resting, Elena said, taking the mug he offered. Probably. He lowered himself into the armchair with a sigh. But since you're here, tell me what's troubling you. Elena perched on the edge of the sofa. When I try to play with emotion, like you suggested, sometimes it works. But then I get nervous about tomorrow and I fall back into just playing the notes perfectly, but emptily. That's fear talking, Garvey said. Fear of vulnerability. Fear of judgment. How do I get past it? Garvey took a sip of his tea before answering. You have to decide what matters more, being technically perfect and safe or being genuine and taking a risk. But I want both, Elena said. We all do. Garvey smiled faintly. Life rarely allows it. They sat in silence for a few minutes, sipping tea. Elena's gaze kept returning to the piano. When was the last time you played? She asked, nodding toward the instrument. Garvey followed her gaze. Truly played? Years. I dusted occasionally. Touched the keys. But not with any purpose. Why keep it then? Some things you can't let go of even when they cause pain. He set down his mug. It was my mother's, as I said. She taught piano to neighborhood children. Not professionally trained, but she had a natural gift. Elena tried to imagine a younger Garvey watching his mother teach, perhaps learning from her himself. She's the one who noticed my ability, he continued. Saved for years to get me proper lessons. When I was accepted to Juilliard, she cried with joy. His voice grew softer. She died 2 months later. Sudden heart attack. My father fell apart. My younger sisters needed support. College wasn't an option anymore. I'm sorry, Elena whispered. Garvey shrugged. Ancient history now. But Elena could see it wasn't, not really. The pain was still there, buried beneath years of resignation. Would she have wanted you to give it up completely? Elena asked gently. The piano, I mean. Garvey looked startled by the question. I don't know. I never thought about it that way. You told me that when you play you should have something to say, Elena pressed. What would you say now if you could play again? Really play? He didn't answer, but his gaze lingered on the piano with a new intensity. Elena stood and moved toward the instrument. May I? After a moment, Garvey nodded. She sat at the bench and placed her hands on the keys. The piano was out of tune, but not terribly so. Elena began to play, not her evaluation piece, but the simple folk melody her grandmother had taught her. When she finished, she turned to find Garvey watching her, his expression unreadable. Your evaluation, he said suddenly. What are you most afraid of? The question caught her off guard. Failing, I suppose. No, Garvey shook his head. That's too simple. What are you really afraid of? Elena thought about it. That I'll play perfectly and they still won't think it's enough. That I'll never be able to make them feel what I want them to feel. There's your answer then, Garvey said. Stop trying to make them feel anything. Play for yourself. Play what you feel, not what you think they want to feel. But the scholarship will go to the pianist who moves the judges, not the one who tries to please them. He coughed, the sound harsh in the quiet room. Trust your own emotional response to the music. If you feel it, they will too. Elena nodded slowly. I should go. You need rest. She stood gathering her bag. Thank you for the tea and the advice. At the door, she paused. Will you be there tomorrow? I don't think... Please, she interrupted. It would mean a lot to me. Garvey hesitated. I'll try, he finally said. The next day, the music hall filled with professors, students, and several visitors, including Mrs. Chen. Elena peeked through the curtain at the side of the stage, scanning the back row. No sign of Garvey. Her heart sank, but she pushed away the disappointment. Focus. As she waited for her name to be called, Elena closed her eyes and thought about what Garvey had said. Play for yourself. Feel it. And they will too. She thought about her grandmother. about the joy of playing simply for the love of music. She thought about Garvey's mother saving for years to give her son lessons, about dreams deferred and passions set aside. She thought about the look on Garvey's face when he watched her play, a mixture of appreciation and regret, of pleasure and pain. Elena Dawson. Professor Lee's voice called from the stage. Elena stepped out into the bright lights, her heart pounding. She bowed briefly to the judges and moved to the piano. As she sat and adjusted the bench, her gaze swept the back of the hall one more time. Still no Garvey. Play for yourself, she reminded herself. Not for them. Not even for him. She placed her hands on the keys, took a deep breath, and began to play. The first notes of Beethoven's Pathetique Sonata filled the hall as Elena began to play. She had performed this piece dozens of times in practice, but today felt different. Instead of focusing on perfect technique, she allowed herself to feel the music, its sadness, its longing, its moments of hope breaking through despair. The audience faded from her awareness. There was only the piano, the music, and the emotions flowing through her fingers into the keys. As she reached the second movement, Elena thought of Garvey, of dreams abandoned and passions set aside. She thought of his mother saving for years to give her son lessons, of his quiet dignity as he pushed his cleaning cart through the university halls. When she began the third movement, her fingers moved with a confidence she had never felt before. This wasn't about impressing the judges or earning a scholarship anymore. This was about honoring the music itself and the people who had helped her understand its true meaning. As the final notes resonated through the hall, Elena lifted her hands from the keys and exhaled slowly. For a moment there was complete silence. Then applause erupted, starting in the back row and spreading forward like a wave. Elena stood and bowed, her heart pounding. Through the stage lights she could make out Professor Lee's face. He was smiling broadly. Beside him, Mrs. Chen was writing something in a small notebook, her expression unreadable. As Elena left the stage, Professor Lee intercepted her. "Magnificent, Miss Dawson. I've never heard you play with such emotion." "Thank you, Professor," Elena said, still slightly dazed. Mrs. Chen was quite impressed. She'd like to speak with you after all the performances. Elena nodded, barely registering his words. Her eyes were scanning the back of the hall, searching for a familiar figure. "Were you looking for someone?" Professor Lee asked, following her gaze. "Yes, Elena paused. How could she explain that she was looking for the university janitor? Just a friend. I thought they might be here. Well, the results will be announced tomorrow, Professor Lee said. But between us, I think you have an excellent chance at that Vienna scholarship." Elena thanked him again and slipped out through the side door. The hallway was crowded with other students waiting to perform, but Garvey was nowhere to be seen. Disappointment settled in her chest. She had hoped he would witness the moment when she finally understood his advice, when she truly played with both technical skill and emotional depth. Later that evening, long after the evaluations had ended, Elena returned to the music hall. It was quiet now. The lights dimmed except for a single spotlight illuminating the piano on stage. She walked slowly down the center aisle, her footsteps echoing in the empty space. When she reached the stage, she noticed something on the piano bench, a folded piece of paper. She picked it up and opened it, immediately recognizing Garvey's elegant handwriting. "I heard you today, not just the notes but what you were saying through them. You found your voice."
TG, Elena smiled, running her fingers over the words.
He had been there after all. She sat at the piano, placing the note carefully beside her, and began to play. Not Beethoven this time, but the simple folk melody her grandmother had taught her. As the familiar notes filled the hall, she heard the side door open. Garvey appeared in the doorway, his cleaning cart nowhere in sight. He looked better than yesterday, though still pale. "You came," Elena said, stopping mid-measure. "I did." He walked slowly down the aisle. "I sat in the very back, left before anyone could see me. But how did you know I'd come back tonight?" Garvey smiled. "Because you're a musician. After a performance like that, you'd want to be near the piano again. To process." He was right, Elena realized. She had been drawn back to the hall almost without thinking. "You were amazing today," Garvey said, stopping at the edge of the stage. "You played like you had something to say." "I did," Elena replied softly. "I was telling your story and mine, and everyone who's ever loved music." Garvey nodded, understanding in his eyes. "That's why they responded. Real emotion resonates with people in a way that perfect technique never will. Professor Lee thinks I might get the Vienna scholarship, Elena said. You deserve it. They were quiet for a moment, the air between them filled with unspoken words. Elena felt a strange sadness mixed with her joy, as if something important was coming to an end. I've been thinking, Garvey said finally, about what you asked yesterday, whether my mother would have wanted me to give up piano completely. And she wouldn't have, he said simply. She believed music was a gift that should be shared, not buried. Elena smiled. She sounds like a wise woman. She was. Garvey took a deep breath. I've decided to start playing again. Nothing grand, maybe teach a few students. Share what I know. That's wonderful, Elena said, genuinely happy for him. Your playing today reminded me of something I'd forgotten. That music isn't just about performance. It's about connection, communication. He looked slightly embarrassed. I have you to thank for that reminder. Elena shook her head. I should be thanking you. Your advice changed everything for me. Garvey glanced at the piano, hesitation clear on his face. Then with a decisive movement he climbed the steps to the stage. Would you mind? He asked, gesturing to the bench. Elena slid over, making room. For a moment, Garvey just sat there staring at the keys as if they might burn him. Then he placed his hands on the piano, closed his eyes, and began to play. The piece was unknown to Elena. Something original, perhaps. It started simply, almost tentatively, like a question being asked. Then it grew, becoming more complex and confident, weaving joy and sorrow together in a way that made Elena's heart ache. His technique was rusty in places, his fingers occasionally stumbling over particularly difficult passages, but the emotion in the music was so raw, so genuine, that the technical imperfections hardly mattered. When he finished, Garvey kept his hands on the keys for a long moment, his eyes still closed. Elena sat beside him speechless. The hall was silent except for the soft echo of the final notes. That was beautiful, she finally whispered. Garvey opened his eyes, looking almost surprised to find himself at the piano. It's been a very long time. What was it called? It doesn't have a name, he said. It's just something I've carried in my head for years. Never written down. You should call it Return, Elena suggested. Garvey considered this, then nodded. Perhaps I will. The side door opened again, and they both turned to see Professor Lee entering with Mrs. Chen. I thought I heard music, Professor Lee said, looking surprised to find the janitor sitting at the piano with his star pupil. Mr. Garvey? Mrs. Chen studied them with curious eyes. That piece you were just playing, it was yours? Garvey stood quickly, embarrassment coloring his face. Yes, I apologize for using the piano without permission. I should go. No, Mrs. Chen said firmly. That was extraordinary. Raw, certainly, but with remarkable emotional depth. She turned to Professor Lee. You didn't tell me you had another pianist of this caliber on staff. Professor Lee looked bewildered. I wasn't aware. Mr. Garvey was accepted to Juilliard, Elena interjected. Years ago. Mrs. Chen's eyebrows rose. Indeed. And now you work as... I'm on the maintenance staff, Garvey said, his voice steady despite his obvious discomfort. I clean the music hall. Instead of the dismissal Elena expected, Mrs. Chen nodded thoughtfully. Music takes many paths. Some of the greatest artists I know have lived unexpected lives. She turned to Elena. Miss Dawson, your performance today was exceptional. The Vienna scholarship is yours if you want it. Elena's heart leaped. Thank you. I'm honored. Don't thank me yet, Mrs. Chen continued, because I have a proposal for both of you. She explained that besides the performance scholarship, she was funding a composition program. Selected students would work with experienced composers to develop original pieces. Mr. Garvey, what I just heard suggests you have considerable talent as a composer, despite your lack of formal training. Mrs. Chen's gaze was direct, assessing. Would you consider serving as a mentor in this program? Part-time, of course. You could keep your current position if you wish. Garvey looked stunned. I'm not qualified. I never completed my education. Education comes in many forms, Mrs. Chen said dismissively. You clearly understand music at a fundamental level. That's what I need for this program. Professor Lee, recovering from his initial shock, nodded enthusiastically. This is an excellent idea. Mr. Garvey's perspective would be unique. Garvey turned to Elena, a question in his eyes. You have something to say? she reminded him softly, echoing his own words back to him. This is your chance to say it. Something shifted in Garvey's face. A weight lifting, a door opening. He turned back to Mrs. Chen and nodded. I would be honored to try. 6 months later, Elena stood in the arrivals hall of Vienna International Airport, her bags packed for a summer of intensive study. The scholarship had been everything she'd hoped for. Challenging, inspiring, transformative. Her phone chimed with a message. It was from Garvey, now teaching part-time in the composition program while continuing his maintenance job at the university. He had sent a recording of his latest piece performed by his students. Elena put in her earbuds and listened as the music filled her head. It was beautiful, technically imperfect in places but alive with genuine emotion. Just like that first night when the janitor had finally sat down at the piano. As she collected her bags and headed for the exit, Elena smiled to herself. She had come to Vienna to perfect her technique, but what she carried with her was much more valuable, the understanding that true music, like true life, wasn't about flawless performance but about authentic expression. And that lesson had come not from her prestigious professors or expensive education, but from a janitor who had once made a difficult choice and lived with its consequences with quiet dignity. A taxi driver approached, asking in accented English where she wanted to go. The academy, Elena replied, then added, but could we take the scenic route? I'm in no hurry. As the taxi pulled away from the curb, Elena opened her notebook and began sketching musical notations, the beginning of her own composition. She would call it The Janitor's Waltz, and it would tell the story of two people who had taught each other that the most important things in music and in life couldn't be found in technique alone, but in the courage to be vulnerable, to connect, and to share your true self with the world. The morning rush at Sunrise Cafe had finally slowed down. Maya Bennett wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand and took a deep breath. 6 hours into her shift, her feet already ached in her worn-out shoes. She glanced at her watch. Still another 4 hours to go before she could head home. Order up, called Pete from the kitchen window, sliding 2 plates of pancakes onto the counter. Maya tucked a strand of brown hair behind her ear and grabbed the plates. Thanks, Pete, she said with a tired smile before heading to table 7. Here you go, Maya said, setting the plates in front of an elderly couple who had been coming to the cafe every Thursday morning for as long as she'd worked there. Can I get you anything else? This looks wonderful, dear, the woman said. I think we're all set. Maya nodded and moved on to her next task. This had been her life for the past 3 years, serving food, refilling coffee cups, and making small talk with customers. It wasn't what she had planned for herself, but plans had a funny way of changing. Behind the counter, Maya caught sight of her boss, Nancy, waving her over with an urgent look on her face. With a sigh, Maya made her way over, already guessing what this meant. Tina called in sick again, Nancy said, confirming Maya's suspicion. Can you stay for the dinner shift? I know it's a lot to ask, but we're really short-staffed tonight. Maya wanted to say no. Her body was tired, and the thought of another 6 hours on her feet made her want to cry. But she needed the money. Her rent was due next week, and her car had been making a strange noise that she couldn't afford to ignore much longer. Sure, Maya said, forcing a smile. I can stay. Nancy's face flooded with relief. You're a lifesaver, Maya. Truly. Oh, and don't forget we've got that big birthday party coming in tonight. Table for 15. The Hendersons. They reserved the back room. Maya nodded, making a mental note. The big parties were exhausting but usually meant better tips, and she desperately needed every extra dollar she could get. As the afternoon wore on, Maya moved through her tasks on autopilot. Take orders, deliver food, clear tables, smile, repeat. Her mind wandered as her body went through the familiar motions. 5 years ago, she would never have imagined this would be her life. 5 years ago, she had been a student at the prestigious Westfield Conservatory of Music, her future bright with possibility. Piano had been her life since she was 6 years old. Her teachers had called her gifted, exceptional, a rare talent. Music scholarships had paid her way through school, and everyone, including Maya herself, had believed she was destined for concert halls and recording studios. Then came the panic attack during her final recital. The one that mattered most. The one that would have opened doors to a professional career. Maya shook her head, pushing the memory away. There was no point dwelling on the past. That life was over. Maya, Nancy called from the office. Can you come in here for a minute? Maya finished refilling a customer's water glass and headed to the small office at the back of the cafe. Nancy was sitting at her desk frowning at some paperwork. Close the door, would you? Nancy asked, looking up as Maya entered. We've got a problem with the Henderson party tonight. Maya's heart sank. They're not canceling, are they? There went her chance at those extra tips. No, they're still coming. But I just got a call from the keyboard player they hired for entertainment. He's got food poisoning or something and can't make it. Nancy ran a hand through her graying hair, clearly stressed. Mrs. Henderson is beside herself. This party is for her husband's 60th and she's been planning it for months. Maya nodded sympathetically, not sure why Nancy was telling her this. That's too bad. Maybe they can find someone else last minute. Nancy's expression changed, a small smile forming on her lips. That's actually what I wanted to talk to you about. I was looking at your employment application the other day, needed to update some files, and I noticed something interesting. Maya felt a chill run down her spine. She had a feeling she knew where this was going. You went to Westfield Conservatory, Nancy continued, for piano performance. You never mentioned that before. Maya swallowed hard. It didn't seem relevant to waiting tables. Well, it's certainly relevant now. Nancy leaned forward. Maya, we have that old keyboard in the storage room. The one we used to use for the Sunday brunches before we started piping in music. It's not fancy, but it works. You could play for the Hendersons tonight. Maya's stomach twisted into knots. Nancy, I don't play anymore. But you could, right? For tonight? It would really save the day. Mrs. Henderson was nearly in tears on the phone. I haven't touched a keyboard in years, Maya protested, her heart racing. The very thought of sitting down at a keyboard, of people watching her, judging her, made her palms sweat. Like riding a bike, isn't it? Nancy said cheerfully, clearly not understanding. And it's just a birthday party at a cafe. Not Carnegie Hall, they'll be so busy eating and drinking. They'll hardly notice what you're playing. Maya opened her mouth to refuse again, but Nancy cut her off. I'll pay you extra, of course. Double your hourly wage for the time you're playing, plus you'll still get your share of tips from the party. She gave Maya a knowing look. And didn't you tell me last week that your car needs repairs? The car, the rent, the stack of bills waiting on her kitchen counter. Maya felt trapped. I'll see what I can do, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Wonderful. Nancy clapped her hands together. I'll let Mrs. Henderson know we've solved her problem. The party starts at 7, but you can set up a bit earlier if you need to get comfortable with the keyboard. As Nancy picked up the phone to call Mrs. Henderson, Maya slipped out of the office feeling slightly dazed. What had she just agreed to? After 3 years of carefully avoiding anything to do with her former life, she was going to sit down at a keyboard again? In front of people? The rest of her shift passed in a blur of anxiety. Every time she thought about the evening ahead, her chest tightened. By 6 o'clock, as she helped the afternoon server set up the back room for the party, Maya was seriously considering making up an excuse and leaving. The keyboard's all set up, said Raj, the busboy, wheeling in the dusty electronic keyboard from the storage room. Had to hunt around for the power cord, but I found it. Seems to work okay. Maya stared at the keyboard as if it were a venomous snake. It was an old model, probably from the early 2000s, with worn keys and a scratched surface, a far cry from the beautiful grand pianos she had once played. Thanks, she managed to say, her mouth dry. Raj gave her a curious look. Nancy said you're going to play tonight. I didn't know you were a musician. I'm not, Maya said quickly. Not anymore. I just know how to play a little. At 6:45, Maya changed from her food-stained work shirt into the clean black button-up she always kept in her bag for emergencies. She washed her face in the employee bathroom and tried to make herself presentable, though there wasn't much she could do about the dark circles under her eyes from too many double shifts. The Henderson party began arriving at 7, filling the back room with noise and laughter. Maya watched from a distance, her stomach in knots, as Nancy greeted them warmly and showed them to their tables. Mr. Henderson, the birthday man himself, was a jovial-looking guy with a loud laugh who seemed genuinely surprised by the party his wife had arranged. At 7:30, after everyone had ordered drinks and appetizers, Nancy caught Maya's eye and nodded toward the keyboard. It was time. Maya's legs felt like lead as she made her way to the small cleared area where the keyboard stood. A few of the party guests glanced her way, but most were engaged in conversation, just as Nancy had predicted. Maybe this wouldn't be so bad. Maybe she could just play softly in the background and no one would really listen. With trembling hands, Maya sat down on the stool in front of the keyboard. She stared at the keys, her mind suddenly blank. What should she play? It had been so long. She placed her fingers on the keys and muscle memory took over. A simple C major scale. The keys were stiffer than she remembered. The action not as smooth as the instruments she'd trained on, but the notes rang out clearly enough. Maya closed her eyes for a moment, trying to calm her racing heart. She could do this. Just background music. Nothing complicated, nothing personal. She began with Happy Birthday, of course, a simple arrangement that she embellished just slightly out of habit. A few guests turned to look, and Mr. Henderson raised his glass to her with a smile. Maya nodded back, her hands still moving over the keys. From there she transitioned into some easy listening pieces, the kind of inoffensive music you might hear in an elevator or a department store. Her fingers moved automatically while her mind stayed carefully detached. This wasn't really playing, she told herself. This was just making noise to fill the space. As the first hour passed, Maya began to relax slightly. No one was paying much attention to her. Servers moved around delivering food and drinks, conversations flowed, and Mr. Henderson opened his gifts amid much laughter and applause. Maya was just part of the background, exactly as she wanted to be, and then without really meaning to, she began to play something else, something of her own.